A late night in her office shattered the carefully constructed boundaries between us, shifting everything in one unguarded moment. I had expected this to be just another job, another rung on the ladder, but stepping into Diane's world felt like crossing into uncharted territory. She was unlike anyone I'd ever worked with, sharp, always a step ahead, the kind of person who could command a room without uttering a word. When she first welcomed me, her smile was warm but measured, as if she were already assessing me in ways I couldn't yet grasp. Our first real interaction remains etched in my memory. It came after a grueling meeting where I barely kept pace with the discussions. As I tried to slip back to my desk, I felt her gaze on me. "Can I see you in my office for a moment?" she asked, her tone polite yet firm. My heart skipped a beat as I followed her down the hallway, bracing for criticism. But instead of reprimanding me, she gestured to the chair across from her desk and sank into her seat with a sigh, as though letting her guard down for the first time that day. "First weeks can be rough," she said with a faint smile, her voice softer than I'd heard before. "It's a lot to absorb, isn't it?" I nodded, grateful for her understanding. We talked for a while, and she shared stories of her early career, the mistakes she'd made, and how she'd learned to push through. "There's something about you," she said thoughtfully, almost to herself. A surge of pride washed over me. It was the first hint that she saw me as more than just another junior employee. Little did I know that moment marked the beginning of something I could never have anticipated. From then on, things shifted subtly. Diane began involving me in more projects, seeking my input during meetings, and calling me into her office after hours for conversations that stretched longer than planned. Each interaction felt like an invitation into her world, slowly, deliberately, as if testing the waters. The late nights became a pattern. She was often one of the last to leave the office, a habit we shared. More often than not, I'd find myself in her office long after everyone else had gone, discussing strategies, brainstorming ideas, or simply working in companionable silence. She had a way of making me feel valued, as though my thoughts mattered, as though I were her equal despite our difference in experience. One evening, after an exhausting day of back-to-back meetings, she caught me by the coffee machine. "You look like you could use something stronger than that," she quipped, her eyes glinting with a rare humor reserved for moments outside work's formalities. "Long day," I replied with a tired smile. "Coffee isn't cutting it." She glanced around the empty office. "How about a change of scenery? There's a great little place around the corner." Her invitation caught me off guard. Bosses didn't casually invite juniors out for drinks, especially not someone like her. The bar she took me to was quiet and dimly lit, its relaxed charm a stark contrast to the office's relentless pace. She ordered a drink and leaned back with a contented sigh. "Sometimes I wonder if this job is worth it," she mused, swirling her glass. Her admission stunned me. It was surreal to hear someone so composed voice doubts aloud. She looked at me then, a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "It's funny," she said softly, "how the people you meet along the way can change everything." Her gaze lingered on mine just a second longer than usual, and I felt an unspoken shift, as though we'd crossed some invisible line. From that night on, an unspoken understanding seemed to form between us. We never addressed it directly, but there was a new energy, a quiet tension that lingered beneath our interactions. At times during meetings, I'd catch her watching me from across the room, her gaze holding mine just a beat too long, her expression unreadable. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. After all, she was my boss, and I couldn't afford to let my thoughts wander. But then came that Friday evening. The office had emptied out early for the weekend. I was wrapping up a last-minute report when Diane appeared at my desk looking more exhausted than I'd ever seen her. "How about one final catch-up before the weekend?" she asked with a weary smile. I followed her into her office expecting our usual recap of the week. But as soon as we were alone, the atmosphere shifted palpably. She closed the door, her hand lingering on the knob for a moment before she turned to face me, leaning against her desk with arms crossed. "You've really impressed me these past few months," she began, her tone softer than usual. "It's rare to find someone who can keep up with the pace around here." I managed to smile, trying to stay composed, but my heart raced uncontrollably. It wasn't just her words, it was the way she looked at me, as though we were both teetering on the edge of something neither of us dared name. As she continued speaking, her voice quieter now, I realized this wasn't just praise, it was vulnerability laid bare. She spoke of the weight of responsibility, the personal sacrifices she'd made in the nights spent alone in her office, questioning whether it was all worth it. Her gaze met mine, and for the first time I saw Diane not as my boss or the formidable figure everyone else knew, but as a person, someone who felt just as uncertain and exposed as I did in that moment. Our conversation drifted effortlessly, and as minutes turned into hours, time seemed to dissolve. Diane laughed freely now, her guard completely down, as she shared stories from her past and travels. Her laughter was contagious, and soon I was laughing with her, the barriers between us momentarily forgotten. But as the laughter faded, a heavy silence settled in, the air thick with something unspoken. She looked at me, her expression unreadable, and a wave of emotions surged through me, ones I couldn't quite contain. There was something in her eyes, something that made me feel as though I was the only one who truly understood her. She broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I'd do without these moments." Her words were simple, yet they carried a weight that lingered. I wanted to respond, to articulate everything swirling inside me, but no words came. Instead, I nodded, hoping she understood. For a fleeting moment, we were just two people, two souls reaching out in a world that often felt overwhelming. But then, as quickly as it had come, the moment passed. She straightened, clearing her throat as if to dispel the vulnerability she'd just shown. "Well," she said, her tone returning to its usual calm, "I suppose we should both call it a night." I nodded, a strange mix of disappointment and relief washing over me as I stood to leave. But as I reached the door, her hand brushed my arm. I turned, and she was closer than she'd ever been before. Her eyes locked with mine, and for a heartbeat, it felt like I could see straight into her soul. "Thank you," she said softly. "For listening. For being here." Her words hung in the air as I stepped out of her office, my mind reeling from the intensity of it all. I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd crossed a line, that things between us would never be the same again. In the weeks that followed, something shifted. Diane and I continued working together on various projects, but now there was an unspoken tension, a thread connecting us that neither of us dared to name. The air between us felt charged, every glance and silence heavy with meaning. One late evening, as I wrapped up a report, Diane's voice called from her office. "Could you come here for a moment?" Her tone was calm but carried an undercurrent I couldn't place. I took a deep breath, steadying myself as I walked to her office, trying to appear composed despite my racing pulse. When I entered, she didn't look up immediately, absorbed in a document on her desk. Finally, she set down her pen and met my gaze. "Close the door," she said simply. The request felt weighted. I shut the door behind me, suddenly aware of how empty the office was, just the two of us alone in the quiet hum of the air conditioner. "Sit down," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. As I sat, I noticed a tension in her expression, a crack in her usual composure. She studied me for a moment before speaking. "Lately," she began, her voice softer than usual, almost hesitant. "I've been thinking about connections. How people cross paths for reasons we might not even understand." She paused mid-sentence, catching herself. For the first time, I saw her falter, her poise slipping ever so slightly. "Diane," I said gently, leaning forward as if drawn by something deeper, something unspoken. "Is everything all right?" Her lips parted slightly as though she wanted to say something profound, something that might clarify the tension between us. But then she shook her head faintly, a small smile tugging at her mouth. "I'm fine," she replied, though her eyes told a different story. "Just too many late nights." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable but charged with anticipation, as if we were both waiting for something more than words could convey. And then, just like before, the moment dissolved as professionalism reclaimed its place, brisk tones replaced softness, masks slid back into position. In the days that followed, we tried to maintain distance to keep things professional, but no matter how hard either of us tried, the tension lingered and grew stronger with each passing day. Then one evening after hours, when most of the office had emptied out, Diane called me back into her office once more. The room was quiet now except for the faint hum of city lights streaming through the windows. We stood there, caught between duty and desire, unsure which path would bring us closer or pull us further apart. Our hands brushed lightly, a spark igniting something long suppressed beneath the surface. Our eyes locked for what felt like an eternity, a silent conversation passing between us without a single word spoken. And then we broke away, knowing full well that nothing would ever be the same again. Back in the room, neither of us spoke, yet it felt like we were both silently acknowledging what had been building between us all along. "I don't know what I'm doing," she murmured almost to herself, so quietly that I could barely hear it. Her hand lingered near mine, waiting perhaps for me to make some kind of move. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me, pull back, walk away before things went too far, but something else held me there, rooted place. Without thinking, reached out, took hold, hers fingers barely grazing it, small, almost innocent gesture, yet felt monumental. She didn't pull away, instead tightened grip around mine, silent acknowledgement, everything we both too afraid say aloud. "Diane," I whispered, but she shook her head before I could finish, her gaze falling to the floor. "This isn't right," she said, her voice tinged with regret. Yet she didn't pull away. "I've worked so hard to keep things professional, to stay in control. But with you..." Her words trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. I knew what she meant. She had tried to maintain distance, to uphold boundaries, but something had shattered that resolve, leaving us both standing on uncertain ground. "I feel it too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I tried to ignore it, but I can't pretend anymore." For a moment, we stood there, hands clasped, each of us grappling with the weight of what was unfolding. It was wrong, we both knew that. She was my boss, and we were crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Yet in that moment, the risks and consequences felt distant, almost irrelevant. Then, abruptly, she released my hand and stepped back, as if suddenly aware of where we were. "This can't happen," she said firmly, her voice steady, once more the tone she was known for. "We can't let this, whatever this is, affect our work." I nodded, swallowing hard, a strange mix of disappointment and relief washing over me. "I understand." She nodded too, though the tension in her expression didn't ease. "Maybe it's best if we keep our distance for a while," she suggested, her words sounding almost painful. "Focus on work. Keep things professional." "Of course," I replied. But even as I said it, I knew it was a promise neither of us could fully keep. Something had shifted between us, something irreversible. The days that followed were an awkward dance of avoidance and stolen glances. We both tried to act as though nothing had happened, to pretend everything was normal. But every time our eyes met, or we brushed past each other in the hallway, the unspoken tension hung heavy in the air. Then one evening, as I was gathering my things to leave, she stopped by my desk. Her expression was unreadable. "Are you heading out?" she asked, her tone casual but with an undercurrent that caught me off guard. "I was about to," I replied, feeling my pulse quicken. "Could you spare a few minutes?" she asked. Though her voice was light, there was something deeper in her request, a quiet plea that belied her earlier resolve. I followed her back to her office, each step filled with equal parts anticipation and dread. We'd been here before, this room, these late nights, the quiet intensity that seemed to grow whenever we were alone. As the door clicked shut behind us, I knew this wasn't just another conversation. This was something more, something inevitable. A charged silence filled the room as Diane stood with her back to me, her silhouette framed by the city lights glowing beyond the window. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she stood still, her shoulders tense as if caught in an internal struggle. I took a hesitant step forward, unsure if I should break the silence. "Diane," I said softly, hoping to ease whatever burden she carried. She turned to face me, her eyes holding a mix of emotions I couldn't quite decipher: vulnerability, frustration, and something else that made my pulse quicken. She studied me for a moment as if deciding how much to reveal, how much to risk. "I don't know what's happening here," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought I had control, that I could keep things professional, that whatever I was feeling would pass." Her words trailed off as she took a step closer, her gaze locked onto mine. "But it hasn't, has it?" I asked quietly. She shook her head slowly, a faint resignation tugging at the corners of her lips. They curved into an almost imperceptible smile before disappearing again, weighed down by the thoughts racing through her mind, too fast, too heavy to hold. Her shoulders sagged under the burden, weary but unwilling to give way entirely. She knew she should have surrendered long ago to the inevitable tide rising higher each day, threatening to drown them both beneath its relentless waves. Yet here she stood, resisting still, as if clinging to the last remnants of a shore eroded bit by bit until nothing remained but memories washed clean by the salt-laden air. Her body pressed against mine, her lips conveying emotions too raw for words. It was a connection that transcended speech, a spark smoldering for so long it felt like liberation. As our kiss deepened, her hands traveled down my back, pulling me closer until no space remained between us. Her breath warmed my cheek, and the rapid rhythm of her heart mirrored my own. It was intoxicating, overwhelming, and for the first time, I surrendered completely to the moment, letting go of every reason this shouldn't be happening. "Diane," I whispered, my voice barely audible as our lips parted briefly. She looked up at me, her eyes dark and filled with emotions I'd never seen before. There was a vulnerability in her gaze, an openness that tightened my chest. "I shouldn't be doing this," she murmured, yet her fingers clung to me as if afraid I might vanish. "But I don't want to stop," I replied, my voice steady, my resolve unshakable. "We've held back for too long." She nodded, her hesitation melting away. In that instant, all the boundaries we'd set dissolved. We lost ourselves in each other, our shared restraint giving way to an intensity neither of us could control. She pulled me closer again urgently. There wasn't enough time left now before someone walked through those doors or called out from down below asking why lights were still burning upstairs after hours upon end without restful sleep awaiting either one individually nor collectively together anymore, since neither wanted anything else besides being wrapped tightly around each other forevermore until death do part ways finally someday far off into distant futures yet unknown, but hoped for eagerly. Nonetheless, despite knowing full well how impossible such dreams truly are given current circumstances surrounding lives lived apart outwardly while inwardly yearning endlessly towards union everlasting regardless consequences faced head-on bravely together hand in hand side by side always forevermore amen amen amen. Our hearts beat in sync, our closeness a living, breathing force that wrapped around us like a second skin. The days that followed felt surreal, as if I were straddling two worlds. In the office, Diane and I exchanged polite nods, our interactions clipped and professional. Yet beneath the surface, the memory of that night lingered, a quiet undercurrent that had shifted something fundamental between us. Every glance carried the weight of what we couldn't say, a silent reminder of the connection simmering beneath our composed facades. The tension only grew, a strange mix of exhilaration and unease as we navigated the boundaries we'd set in the aftermath. Her presence became impossible to ignore, the way she walked past my desk, the way her gaze lingered just a beat too long. It was a constant pull, a quiet challenge to keep my focus intact. Then, one Friday evening, it all came to a head. The office was emptying out after a grueling week when Diane stopped by my desk. "Could you meet me in the conference room?" she asked, her tone calm but her eyes betraying something deeper, something that made my pulse quicken. "Of course," I replied, keeping my voice steady even as my mind raced ahead. I grabbed my things and followed her down the hall. She moved with purpose, her stride confident until we reached the conference room. She closed the door behind us and turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk," she said, her voice soft but firm. I sat down as she paced briefly before settling across from me. Her eyes locked onto mine, steady and direct. "What happened between us," she began, "was real. And I don't regret it." Her words hung in the air, raw and honest, catching me off guard. "But we can't keep pretending it hasn't changed things, that it won't affect how we work together." I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words settle over me. "I know," I said quietly. "I've been feeling it too." She sighed deeply, clasping her hands tightly as if grounding herself. "I've been in this industry long enough to know what happens when personal and professional lines blur." Her gaze never wavered. "And I care too much about my career and about you to let this spiral out of control." Her admission sent a warm rush through me, but it was tinged with a bittersweet awareness. The reality we both knew loomed large between us, unspoken but undeniable. Pretending her words didn't matter was harder than I let on. They were measured, deliberate, and I realized she was searching for balance, a way to preserve what we had shared without letting it consume us. "I think I can do that," I said, though part of me knew it would be harder than I wanted to admit. We sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the weight of the decision. Both of us understood we were choosing the cautious path, the one that would protect what we had worked so hard to build. It wasn't perfect, but it was necessary. When we finally left the conference room, the office was deserted. The quiet hum of the building stood in stark contrast to the turmoil churning inside me. I walked her to the elevator, our footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. Neither of us spoke as we waited, each lost in our own thoughts. When the elevator arrived, she turned to me, her eyes soft but resolute. "Take care of yourself," she said, a faint smile crossing her lips. "And remember, this isn't goodbye. It's just us finding a way to move forward." "I understand," I replied, a strange mix of closure and longing tightening my chest. "Thank you for everything." The doors closed, and as I watched her disappear, a quiet sense of acceptance settled over me. We had made the right decision, one that respected both our lives and our futures, but that didn't make the feelings any easier to ignore. In the weeks that followed, Diane and I maintained a respectful distance, focusing on our work and gradually settling back into the rhythm of our professional roles. The initial tension slowly faded, replaced by a mutual understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of what we had shared. Though there were moments when I caught myself remembering her touch or the warmth of her presence, I knew it would always be a part of me, a memory I would carry forward. One afternoon, as I was wrapping up a report, she stopped by my desk. Her expression was calm, but her eyes held a glimmer of the person she had shown me during those quiet moments we had shared. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice steady. "For understanding. For being exactly who I thought you were." Her words surprised me, and a warmth spread through me, a quiet validation that reminded me why I had been drawn to her in the first place. "Thank you," I replied with a faint smile. "For everything." She gave a slight nod, and for a brief moment, it felt as though nothing had changed, as though we were back in that office, sharing a connection that transcended the walls around us. But then, with a quiet smile, she turned and walked away, leaving me with a sense of peace. Despite the boundaries we had set, we had both found something meaningful, something worth cherishing. Months passed, and life continued its steady march forward. Our interactions returned to a friendly professionalism, the kind of relationship that had always existed between us before everything had shifted. We became colleagues again, with a shared understanding that didn't need to be spoken aloud, a silent acknowledgement of the depth that lay beneath the surface. Though the intensity of our connection had faded, its impact remained, a quiet reminder of what could have been and what still lingered in the spaces between us. It shaped me, teaching me to value authenticity and the quiet strength of mutual respect. In the years that followed, I watched Diane excel in her career, ascending to roles that demanded every ounce of her talent and resilience. She remained a guiding presence in my life, not just as a mentor but as a friend who had shown me the power of vulnerability and the courage to face hard choices with grace. Occasionally, during those rare moments when we found ourselves alone, we'd exchange a glance, a fleeting echo of a connection that had once transformed us both. It was enough, a quiet acknowledgement of something rare and profound, something that had enriched our lives in ways words could never fully capture. Time as a way of clarifying what truly matters, of illuminating moments we might have once overlooked. Looking back, I'm grateful for the journey we shared, for the lessons learned, and for the quiet strength of a bond that defied expectations. As I moved forward, building new connections and chasing new ambitions, I carried Diane's memory with me. It reminded me of the beauty of authenticity and the enduring power of human connection, of the quiet resilience that lies within us all. Our story didn't conclude with grand gestures or dramatic farewells. Instead, it became woven into the fabric of who I am, a subtle but indelible presence that taught me to cherish the moments that truly matter, the people who leave an imprint on our lives. In the end, I knew our connection was singular, something that would always be part of my story. It was a chapter I'd revisit with gratitude and respect, and perhaps a faint ache for the path we chose not to take. But life is made of choices, paths taken and untaken. While our journey together had reached its natural conclusion, it left me with a deeper understanding. Some connections are meant to be experienced, cherished, and then gently let go. Now, as I reflect, I realize that sometimes the most meaningful stories are the ones that linger, the ones that live on quietly within us, long after their final pages have turned.